There is a specific moment in these kinds of relationships that feels almost unreal when you first experience it. It's the moment you pull back. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing. You stop trying to fix every misunderstanding. You start replying a little later. You start giving less emotional energy. You start choosing yourself in small, almost invisible ways. And what makes this moment so powerful is not what you do. It's what suddenly starts happening to them. Because until that point, the dynamic was predictable. You gave attention. You gave emotional effort. You gave patience. You gave access to your thoughts, your reactions, your inner world. And in return, you may have received inconsistency, confusion, moments of warmth followed by distance, affection followed by withdrawal. You might not have had the language for it at the time, but something inside you was always slightly off. Like you were constantly adjusting yourself just to keep emotional stability in the relationship. And then you change. You withdraw. And suddenly, the emotional system that was built around your availability starts to shift. At first, it might not look like much. In fact, it often looks like nothing at all. That's part of what makes it confusing. They might seem calm, unbothered, even slightly indifferent. But that calm is not neutrality, it's observation. Because when a person who relies heavily on control, attention, or emotional validation notices that their usual source is no longer flowing the same way, they don't immediately react in a straight line. They assess. They test. They try to understand what changed without directly asking. And this is where many people get pulled back in without realizing it. Because the first response is often subtle. A sudden message that feels light. A casual check-in that doesn't match the emotional distance that had been growing. A small attempt to reopen communication as if nothing had shifted. And if you respond warmly, even slightly, the cycle stabilizes again. But if you stay consistent in your withdrawal, something else begins to happen beneath the surface. Not immediately anger, not immediately panic, but discomfort. Because your emotional availability was part of the structure they were relying on, even if it wasn't acknowledged out loud. And when that structure weakens, control starts to feel uncertain. At this point, the behavior often becomes more noticeable. There can be increased attention, more messages, more presence, sometimes even sudden warmth that feels almost exaggerated compared to what you were receiving before. This can feel confusing because it seems like things are improving, but what's actually happening is not emotional clarity, it's recalibration. The system is trying to restore balance by pulling you back into your previous role. And if you've ever been in this dynamic, you know how powerful that shift can feel. Because part of you wants to believe that the warmth is real, that things are changing, that maybe they finally understand your value. But what matters here is consistency, not intensity. Because in emotionally imbalanced relationships, intensity often increases right when control is threatened. And if emotional patterns are not stable, that intensity can feel like connection. But it is often response, not reflection. As your withdrawal continues, another layer begins to appear. If attention doesn't work, emotional pressure may increase. This can show up as guilt-based communication, reminders of what you used to be like, subtle comparisons to your old self, questions that make you doubt your distance, statements that suggest you are being unfair, cold, or different. Not always direct, often implied. And the goal is not necessarily to attack you, it is to destabilize your clarity. Because clarity is what makes withdrawal effective. When you are clear, you don't overreact. You don't rush to repair. You don't abandon your boundary just because discomfort appears. And that clarity changes the emotional power structure. So instead of meeting you where you are, the system tries to pull you back into emotional uncertainty. You may also notice moments of contradiction. Distance followed by sudden attention. Warmth followed by silence again. A pattern that keeps your nervous system slightly off balance. This inconsistency is not accidental in effect, even if it feels chaotic in execution. Because unpredictability creates engagement. When you don't know what will happen next, your mind stays active. It analyzes, it waits, it replays, it tries to solve the pattern. And that mental engagement keeps emotional attachment alive. But when you withdraw, something shifts. Your emotional responses become less immediate. You stop reacting to every shift. You start seeing patterns instead of moments. And that is where the real change begins. Because you are no longer inside the cycle, you are observing it. And from that distance, something becomes very clear. The relationship was not built on emotional stability. It was built on emotional response. On your response to their shifts. On your adjustment to their inconsistency. On your effort to restore balance whenever it broke. And when you stop doing that, the imbalance becomes visible. Not because it suddenly appears, but because you are no longer compensating for it. This is often the moment where the dynamic intensifies again. Not necessarily in a healthy direction, but in a reactive one. There may be attempts to regain closeness quickly, sudden emotional statements, nostalgia, references to good moments, even vulnerability that feels slightly out of place. And this is where many people feel pulled back in, because it can look like insight, like regret, like emotional awareness finally arriving. But the key question is not what is being said, it is what remains consistent afterward. Because real emotional change is steady, it does not appear only when distance is introduced. As you continue to hold your ground, another phase can emerge: frustration. Not always expressed openly, but visible in tone, in timing, in energy. You might notice shorter responses, less patience, subtle irritation, or the opposite, complete withdrawal again as a way to regain control through absence. This back and forth is not random. It is the system reacting to loss of influence. Because when someone who relied on emotional access starts losing it, they often oscillate between strategies: connection, then distance; softness, then coldness; engagement, then silence. All of it aimed at one thing: restoring the previous emotional dynamic. But something important happens during your withdrawal. Even if you feel moments of doubt, even if you feel pulled emotionally, you are no longer fully inside it. You start noticing instead of absorbing. You start pausing instead of reacting. You start questioning instead of accepting. And that space between stimulus and response is where your power begins to return. Because emotional control in these dynamics doesn't come from force. It comes from automatic participation. When you automatically respond, automatically explain, automatically repair, the system continues without interruption. But when you pause, everything slows down. And in that pause, clarity grows. You begin to see that the confusion you felt was not random. It was produced by inconsistency. The self-doubt was not purely internal. It was reinforced by shifting behavior. The emotional exhaustion was not because you were too sensitive, it was because you were constantly adapting to instability. And once you see that clearly, something inside you stops negotiating. Not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually. You begin to emotionally detach from the need to decode every action. You stop trying to find the hidden meaning in every shift. You start accepting behavior as information, not mystery. And this is where empowerment begins to take shape. Because when you are no longer trying to fix confusion, you start protecting your peace instead. Boundaries become less emotional and more practical. You respond when it feels appropriate, not when anxiety pushes you. You stop explaining yourself repeatedly. You stop trying to earn consistency from someone who only offers it occasionally. And what feels difficult at first slowly becomes stabilizing. Because your nervous system is no longer constantly activated by unpredictability. There is a quieter internal space returning, a sense of distance that is not cold, but clear. And in that clarity, you start to understand something important. You were not reacting to love that was complicated. You were reacting to a pattern that was unstable. And your emotional investment was trying to stabilize something that was never consistent to begin with. As that realization settles, the emotional intensity begins to fade. Not because the memory disappears, but because its influence weakens. You still remember, but it no longer defines your emotional state. You still understand what happened, but it no longer pulls you into confusion. This is what detachment actually looks like in practice. Not emotional shutdown, not bitterness, not revenge, but clarity without emotional dependence. And from that place, something very grounded begins to emerge. Self-respect that is not reactive, but steady. You no longer need to prove your worth through emotional endurance. You no longer need to stay in situations that repeatedly destabilize you. You no longer confuse intensity with connection. And slowly, your attention returns to yourself, to your routines, your thoughts, your energy, your sense of direction. The emotional noise becomes quieter. And what remains is something much more stable. A sense of internal balance that does not depend on someone else's behavior staying consistent. You begin to realize that peace was never something you had to earn. It was something you were constantly giving away in exchange for emotional clarity that never fully arrived. And as you reclaim it, the past starts to feel different. Not because it becomes good, but because it loses its grip. You understand it without needing to relive it. You accept it without needing to fix it. And you move forward without needing closure from someone who never provided consistency. In the end, the most important shift is not what they do when you withdraw. It is what happens inside you when you stop participating in instability. Because that is where the cycle breaks. Not in their reaction, but in your return to yourself. And once that happens, even the most confusing dynamics start to lose their power. Not because they change, but because you do.